Michelle Mason thought she had it all until the day she uncovered the secret her husband, Robert, had been hiding for years. A betrayal so shocking, it would unravel everything she thought she knew about her marriage, her family, and herself. The truth wasn't just that Robert had been unfaithful, it was that the woman he'd been secretly seeing was his half-sister, Sarah. What began as a picture-perfect life would soon spiral into a devastating story of love, deception, and a woman's fight to reclaim her life. Michelle Mason had always considered herself fortunate. Married to Robert, a successful lawyer, and raising two bright children in a comfortable suburban home, her life seemed like a dream. The family's house was warm and welcoming, filled with laughter and the bustle of daily life. Robert's career had been on an upward trajectory ever since they'd met, and Michelle had fully supported his ambitions, staying home to care for their kids and manage the household. They had what many would envy: financial stability, a happy marriage, and a seemingly perfect life. But over the past few months, something had begun to shift. At first, it was subtle. Robert, once always attentive and present when he was home, had started to withdraw. He'd come home later than usual, often claiming it was due to extended meetings at work. Michelle didn't question it at first. She trusted him implicitly and was busy with her own routine. But there was a growing sense of unease, a feeling she couldn't shake. There were small changes in his behavior that Michelle couldn't ignore. He had always been affectionate, greeting her with a kiss when he came through the door, but that had dwindled. Now he seemed preoccupied, distracted by his phone or his laptop when they were together. On weekends, Robert would often claim he had to work through the day or take a quick business trip. The excuses, while plausible, began to feel like a cover. Michelle tried to reason with herself, telling herself that maybe Robert was under stress at work, and he simply didn't know how to unwind. Then came the night Michelle started to notice just how much of a stranger Robert had become. It was a Tuesday, and Robert had gone out for a late meeting. Michelle was just finishing up some chores around the house when she noticed that Robert's briefcase, which he always took with him, was still in the entryway. He never forgot it. He was meticulous about his work. The absence of it felt off. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she went to his office to see if anything was out of place. As she sorted through some paperwork, Michelle's eyes fell on the corner of an envelope sticking out of a drawer. It wasn't something Robert had left there. He was always so neat. Everything had its place. Pulling it out, Michelle saw that it was a hotel receipt. The date was from just a few days ago. The location was a high-end hotel in the city center, an area Robert had never mentioned. Her heart skipped a beat. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe he had booked a room for a client or a business event. But why hadn't he mentioned it to her? Why did he need a hotel when they had a perfectly fine home just minutes away? Michelle's mind raced as she ran through the possibilities. Maybe he had a late-night meeting. Maybe he needed to stay somewhere for convenience. But as she stared at the receipt in her hand, the knot in her stomach tightened. She had been so sure of Robert's love and commitment, but now there were too many questions, and they all pointed to something that didn't make sense. The next day, Michelle began paying closer attention to Robert's actions. He had become more elusive, more defensive when she asked even the simplest questions. His once punctual routine of coming home at a certain hour had slipped. Sometimes he would be home earlier, other times much later. When he did speak to her, his responses seemed distracted. She couldn't help but feel like he was hiding something. A growing sense of unease gnawed at Michelle, but it wasn't until the weekend that she would finally make a discovery that would shake her to her core. Robert had mentioned he was going to be working all day Saturday, so Michelle planned to take the kids to a local park. But as they returned home, she noticed Robert's car parked in the driveway. She didn't think much of it at first, but as she walked into the living room, she froze. Robert was on the phone. But it wasn't his usual work call. He was speaking in hushed tones, a level of secrecy in his voice that Michelle had never heard before. She caught only snippets of his conversation, but the words she heard made her heart race. "I miss you too." Something deep inside Michelle told her that the pieces were falling into place, but she couldn't bring herself to believe it. Could Robert really be hiding something as serious as an affair? As the day wore on, she felt herself pulled in two directions, her mind telling her to confront him, but her heart telling her to wait, to understand what was happening before making any accusations. That night, she found herself lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. She knew something was wrong, but she couldn't yet grasp the full picture. Little did she know, the truth was closer than she could ever imagine. The feeling of suspicion had settled deep into Michelle's gut, but it wasn't until the following week that the evidence she needed began to surface. After Robert's strange phone call and the mysterious hotel receipt, Michelle could no longer ignore the fact that something was terribly wrong. She began to take more active steps, trying to find answers without directly confronting her husband just yet. She wasn't sure what she would do if her suspicions were confirmed, but she knew she couldn't live in the dark any longer. One evening, while Robert was at the office, Michelle decided to go through his belongings in search of anything that could explain his odd behavior. She started with his desk, meticulously rifling through his papers. There was the usual legal paperwork, cases, client files, and notes from meetings, but then something caught her eye. Tucked beneath a pile of loose papers, she found an envelope with a name she didn't recognize: Sarah Mason. The name was familiar. It sounded vaguely like one of Robert's distant relatives, but Michelle couldn't place it. She thought about it for a few moments, but her curiosity pushed her to open the envelope. Inside, she found a series of printed emails, several that had clearly been exchanged recently. As Michelle read through them, her heart began to race. The messages were intimate, with the kind of language that was reserved for lovers. Words like "I can't wait to see you again," and "every time we're together, it feels so right," made Michelle's stomach churn. Her mind raced. Was this a client? A colleague? But no, these emails were personal, and they carried an unmistakable tone of affection. The sender, Sarah, had written about their meetings, how much they enjoyed their time together, and how they couldn't stop thinking about each other. She couldn't understand it at first. Who was this Sarah? Why had Robert been exchanging such intimate messages with her? Michelle's hands shook as she continued to read, piecing together the words that painted a picture she wasn't ready to see. The emails weren't just casual exchanges, they were full of longing and passion. Sarah's messages implied that they had been seeing each other for months. Michelle felt a sense of dread settle over her, her mind still trying to make sense of it all. Was Robert having an affair? The realization hit her like a ton of bricks, but still, she didn't want to believe it. She quickly searched for Sarah's name online, desperate to learn more. The results weren't much, but Michelle was able to find a Facebook profile that appeared to match the name on the emails. The photo was of a young woman. Attractive but unremarkable, someone who didn't seem to have any real connection to Michelle's life. Yet, when she clicked on Sarah's profile, something strange happened. As she scrolled down, Michelle's breath caught in her throat. There, in an old family photo album, was a picture of Robert looking younger, but unmistakable, and standing beside a woman who could only be Sarah. But then something clicked. The realization struck her hard. Sarah wasn't just some woman Robert had met. Sarah was his half-sister. Michelle felt her legs weaken beneath her, as the weight of the discovery crushed her. How had she never known? Michelle had been married to Robert for over 10 years, and yet she had never once heard him mention Sarah. It made sense now why Robert had been so secretive, why he had kept this woman, his half-sister, hidden from view. The affair wasn't just with anyone, it was with family. The thought of it was almost too much to comprehend. Michelle's mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? Was this the reason Robert had been so distant? And how had Sarah become so involved in their lives without Michelle even knowing? She couldn't understand why Robert would betray her like this, especially with someone who was so close to him, someone who, like her, had been a part of his past. The lines between family and infidelity were blurred in a way Michelle had never thought possible. Still in shock, Michelle closed her laptop and sat down on the edge of the bed, her thoughts in turmoil. The truth had emerged, but it was so twisted that it felt unreal. She knew she had to confront Robert, but she couldn't bring herself to do it just yet. She needed time to process, to fully grasp the depth of the betrayal. All she could think about was the life she had built with him, the love she thought they had shared, and how it had all been a lie. The weight of the truth settled heavily on Michelle, but as the days passed, it became increasingly difficult to ignore the reality of her situation. She had discovered Robert's affair with his half-sister Sarah, and now the full scope of the betrayal was sinking in. Michelle had always thought of their marriage as a partnership built on love, trust, and shared values, but now everything felt like a carefully constructed illusion. Her husband had been leading a double life, and worse, he had hidden his relationship with Sarah for years, perhaps even before they had married. Michelle found herself questioning everything. She replayed the moments from their marriage, the family vacations, their anniversary dinners, the times they'd celebrated milestones together, and wondered how much of it had been real. Robert had always been a loving, attentive husband. Or at least that's what she had believed. Now she couldn't help but wonder if it had all been an act, a facade to cover up the affair that had been simmering beneath the surface. The emails she had found between Robert and Sarah weren't just a few flirtatious exchanges, they were a history of a passionate relationship, one that spanned months, if not years. The secrecy of it all felt suffocating. For the next few days, Michelle kept her distance from Robert, unable to bring herself to confront him yet. She went through the motions of daily life, caring for their children, preparing meals, and maintaining the household, but her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She had no idea how to handle this situation. Divorce? Confrontation? Her heart told her to leave, but her mind wasn't ready to take such a drastic step without understanding more. She needed to know how deep this betrayal went, and why Robert had kept it hidden for so long. It wasn't until a Friday evening that Michelle decided it was time. Robert had come home late again, as he had on many nights recently. He walked into the house, his face looking tired but still wearing that polished smile he used when he didn't want to show the world what was really going on inside. Michelle's heart pounded in her chest as she watched him. She had all the evidence she needed: the hotel receipt, the intimate emails, and now the undeniable proof that Sarah was, in fact, his half-sister. There was no more room for doubt. Michelle's voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she placed the printouts of the emails on the kitchen counter. Robert stopped in his tracks, his eyes widening for a moment before he quickly masked his expression. He had known this moment was coming, but it still caught him off guard. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Michelle's eyes never left Robert's face as she waited for him to say something, anything. Finally, he broke the silence, but his words didn't bring any relief. Instead, they only deepened Michelle's sense of betrayal. He told her that it wasn't what she thought, that it was all just a mistake, and that he didn't know how it had gotten so far out of hand. Michelle could feel her anger rising as she listened to him try to downplay what had been happening behind her back. "You don't understand," he continued, avoiding eye contact. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way. We were just..." His words trailed off, as if he couldn't bring himself to explain any further. But Michelle didn't need him to. The emails were clear enough. He had been in love with Sarah, his half-sister, for months, maybe longer. What had started as some innocent reconnection after years of being apart had quickly spiraled into something far darker. Michelle had read the words, "I can't wait to see you again. And every time we're together, it feels so right," and the image of Robert, the man she had trusted, whispering those words to Sarah was enough to make her feel physically ill. "Why, Robert?" Michelle asked, her voice barely a whisper. It was a simple question, but it held 1,000 unspoken words. Why had he done this to their family? Why had he chosen his sister over his wife, his children, and everything they had built together? Robert looked defeated. The walls he had so carefully constructed around himself seemed to crumble, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Michelle saw the truth in his eyes. But it wasn't the truth that would heal, it was the truth that would tear everything apart. He admitted that he had been in love with Sarah for years. When their father passed away, the emotional bond they shared had deepened into something more. It was something neither of them had expected, but neither had been willing to stop. Michelle's heart shattered as Robert spoke. His words made no sense. They had been together for so long, and yet he had chosen Sarah, someone who was supposed to be family, to share his most intimate moments with. Michelle's trust had been obliterated, and she felt a deep sense of loss, not just for the marriage, but for the family she had believed in. How could she ever look at him the same way again? That night, as Michelle lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she was left with only one certainty: her world had been irrevocably changed. Robert's confession, though painful, was just the beginning. The long road ahead was uncertain. But one thing was clear: Michelle could no longer live in the shadows of lies. She had to make a decision, and whatever it was, it would be the hardest choice of her life. The days following Michelle's confrontation with Robert were some of the most excruciating of her life. The immediate aftermath of the truth was suffocating. Their once peaceful home, filled with the hum of everyday life, was now dominated by an unbearable tension. The children were oblivious to the storm brewing between their parents, but Michelle couldn't escape the sense of betrayal that weighed on her chest. Robert seemed to be in a state of emotional paralysis, barely speaking except to apologize, but Michelle couldn't bring herself to respond. His apologies meant nothing; they were hollow, empty words without any real substance. Robert, in his attempts to reconcile, offered explanations, weak, disjointed justifications that only seemed to make the pain worse. He told Michelle that the affair with Sarah had started as something innocent after their father's passing, a misguided search for emotional comfort. But no matter how many times he repeated his reasoning, Michelle couldn't find any sense of closure in it. His affair wasn't the product of a single bad decision. It was a long, sustained betrayal, a relationship that, at its core, was built on lies and deception. He had hidden it from her for months, and only now, when he had nowhere to run, was he finally confessing the truth. Every night, Michelle found herself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation over and over in her mind. She couldn't understand how Robert had allowed things to escalate to this point. How had their marriage, which had always seemed solid, become so easily fractured? She had always believed that their bond was unbreakable, but now she saw that it had been held together by a fragile veneer. Beneath the surface, Robert had been hiding his emotional and physical connection with Sarah, someone she had never even known about. Someone who, as it turned out, had been far more significant in his life than she had ever imagined. The hardest part was not the discovery itself, but the realization of how much Robert had manipulated her trust. He had been her partner in every sense of the word, and now that foundation had crumbled. Michelle had dedicated herself to being the best wife and mother she could be. She had sacrificed her own dreams and aspirations to support Robert's career and their family. But all that time she had been living in the shadow of his lies. What hurt the most was that she had never seen it coming. Despite the weight of the emotional toll, Michelle knew one thing for certain: she couldn't keep living like this. She couldn't stay in a marriage that was so fundamentally broken. The betrayal had not only shattered her trust in Robert, but had also destroyed her own sense of identity. She wasn't the woman she had been before. She wasn't the wife who had always believed in their happy family. She was someone else now, a woman facing an uncertain future with more questions than answers. The thought of leaving Robert filled her with dread. The idea of navigating life without him, of tearing apart the family they had built, felt overwhelming. But as much as she hated to admit it, she couldn't stay. She couldn't continue to live with the knowledge of what Robert had done. The betrayal ran too deep, and the wounds were too fresh. There was no going back. One evening, after dinner, Michelle sat down with Robert once more. This time, she wasn't looking for answers, she was looking for a way forward, if there even was one. She knew their marriage couldn't continue in its current state, but she had to make the decision herself. She told Robert that she couldn't live in the same house, under the same roof, with the weight of his affair hanging over her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that she had to leave to heal. Her decision wasn't born from anger, it was born from a desperate need for self-preservation. She had to reclaim her life, her dignity, and her peace of mind. Robert, to his credit, didn't fight her. He looked defeated, remorseful, and emotionally drained. But Michelle couldn't find it in herself to feel pity for him. His guilt didn't undo the damage he had caused, and his sorrow didn't make the choice any easier. The next few weeks were a blur of legal consultations, therapy sessions, and endless heartache. Michelle filed for divorce, and while Robert agreed to an amicable separation for the sake of the children, there were moments when the bitterness of the situation would rear its ugly head. They argued over the house, over custody arrangements, and over the future they had once dreamed of. But each argument was a reminder of how far they had fallen from what they once had. Michelle had moments of doubt, of course. There were nights when she would lay in bed, wondering if she had made the right decision. She missed the comfort of familiarity, the routine of life with Robert. But deep down, she knew that leaving him was the only way to preserve what was left of herself. Every day was a struggle, but with time the pieces of her broken heart began to slowly heal. Eventually, she began to focus on her children, finding solace in their laughter and love. They were the reminder that she still had purpose, that there was still joy to be found in her life. The divorce wasn't easy, and the scars of the betrayal would always be there, but Michelle was determined to move forward. She had been broken, but she was far from defeated. She knew that healing would take time, but she was ready to reclaim her life, piece by painful piece. The house that had once been a symbol of a happy family now stood as a monument to betrayal. But in time, Michelle would learn that even in the aftermath of the darkest storm, there was always a chance for new beginnings. The aftermath of Michelle's decision to leave Robert was harder than she could have ever imagined. The divorce was finalized within a few months, but the emotional weight of the decision lingered far longer. There were days when Michelle felt a profound sense of loss, as if she had lost not only a husband but an entire version of herself that had existed within the confines of that marriage. The house, once full of laughter and the comfort of family life, now felt cold and unfamiliar. It was just a structure, empty walls that no longer held the warmth of love, but the echo of a shattered dream. Despite the emotional toll, Michelle knew she had done the right thing. The betrayal was too deep, and the lies had eroded any foundation that remained between her and Robert. The woman she had been, the trusting wife and devoted mother, was gone. But in her place, a new version of Michelle was slowly emerging. The pain was still raw, but with each passing day she felt a growing sense of strength. The children, too, had their struggles, though they were far too young to fully understand the complexity of the situation. Michelle did her best to shield them from the worst of it, but they could feel the shift in the household. Robert's sporadic visits to see them were always strained, and the awkward silences between him and Michelle made things even harder. The children began asking questions Michelle was not ready to answer. They wanted to know why Daddy wasn't living with them anymore, why he only visited on weekends, and why their family wasn't whole. Each time, Michelle's heart broke a little more. She explained as best as she could, keeping the truth as simple as possible. Sometimes people make mistakes, she told them, and sometimes people need space to grow and become better. It was a vague answer, but it was the only one she could offer without burdening them with the full weight of the situation. Her priority was to ensure that the children felt safe and loved, even in the midst of all the chaos. Robert, for his part, had his own demons to contend with. The affair with Sarah had cost him everything: his marriage, his career, and his reputation. Michelle had been the one to hold the family together for so long, and now, without her, Robert's life seemed to unravel in real time. His law practice, once thriving, was no longer the lucrative business it had been. Clients, disturbed by the scandal, began pulling away, and his colleagues stopped taking him seriously. He tried to reach out to Michelle on several occasions, begging her to reconsider, telling her that he had made a terrible mistake, but his apologies fell on deaf ears. Michelle had no desire to rehash the past. She had been to therapy, worked through the anger, the sadness, and the betrayal, and was beginning to make sense of the pieces of her life that had been scattered. Yet every time Robert reached out, it stirred up a sense of guilt within her, as if she had betrayed him in some way. She knew, deep down, that it wasn't her fault, but the emotional residue of a decade-long relationship couldn't be erased so quickly. Slowly, though, Michelle began to reclaim her life. She reconnected with friends she had put on the back burner during her marriage. She took up new hobbies, things she had abandoned years ago in favor of focusing on the family and Robert's needs. The freedom to be her own person, without constantly managing someone else's expectations, felt like a breath of fresh air. She took a job at a local nonprofit, something she had always wanted to do but had never had the time for. The work gave her a sense of purpose, and it felt good to contribute to a cause greater than herself. And then there were the small victories, moments when she realized she was stronger than she had ever believed. One evening, she sat down in front of the mirror, looking at her reflection, and for the first time in months she smiled. The woman who stared back at her was someone different from the one who had walked into this mess, shattered and uncertain. She was someone who had been through hell but had emerged with a deeper understanding of who she was. Her self-worth was no longer defined by her marriage or her role as Robert's wife. It was defined by her ability to pick herself up and move forward, no matter how hard it seemed. While the divorce had been difficult, Michelle realized that it had been the beginning of something else, something she had not been able to see before. The life she had built with Robert was over, but a new life was waiting for her, one where she could define her own happiness and rediscover her sense of self. She still had moments of doubt and sadness, of course. The scars from the affair were not easy to forget, and sometimes the emptiness of the house was overwhelming. But she had begun to rebuild. Her children, too, were adjusting. It wasn't easy for them, but they were resilient. They had their mother's strength to guide them, and with each day that passed, Michelle saw them becoming more comfortable with the new rhythm of their lives. Robert remained a part of their world, though their relationship was forever changed. But Michelle knew that, in time, they would all find their footing. The journey ahead would not be without challenges. The scars of betrayal would always remain, but Michelle understood now that healing was not a destination, it was a process that required patience, resilience, and the willingness to embrace change. She had been through the worst, but she was far from finished, and as she took her first steps into the future, Michelle knew one thing for certain: she was stronger than she had ever been, and she would never again allow anyone to define her happiness but herself.